it's just a dangerous tool, I think, in many ways,
It can be.
Yeah.
So how do we get as a society back to the basics, back to the things that make sense? How do we get teenagers to value a real life experience? And possibly COVID has helped that in terms of the COVID experience of being at home. They've been with their family. They haven't had so much, maybe they've been on social media. Not, I don't live with teenagers anymore, so I'm not quite sure insofar as how they're spending their day to day. But they've had to come back to basics. Lots of them are baking.
Yeah.
Lots of them
I
are
love
cooking.
hearing that stories. I'm probably, because I'm kind of pushing the buttons here, because, we're probably exaggerating how lost these teenagers are. And maybe they are. There's a lot of them that are aware that they can get out of this world, maybe. Maybe we're underestimating them.
My sense of teenagers is I don't actually underestimate them. I know it's a difficult period in their time, and I know if my son had got through the real struggle, wobbly bits and the speed wobbles, he would have got to the other side. I saw it with my daughter. She got through a wobbly stage and came out the other side. He didn't get to the other side, but they have a resilience in them. They actually are far more talented than I believe some of my generation. Well, we discovered our talents maybe in a different way, but they have ways of expressing themselves now that we didn't even know existed.
Yeah, that's another element of it. Like people like me, Alpha is commenting on younger people. It is a sense of like, I'm not living in the same world, So it's obviously going to, when I see a new world, which is pretty much what's happened in the last 20 years as regards, and the internet is a huge part of that. You're obviously going to say, well, they're missing out on loads of stuff, and they would have been much better off, born in my time, which is absolute rubbish, because every generation.
I'm sure the generation before mine said that. I'm older than you, but even still, that is I kind of say sometimes, my goodness, look at what I didn't exist when I was young. We used to have that game with the kids in the car. When I was small, we didn't have, and the list was miles long. Do you know?
So we were talking about the family thing. Probably is something that these I don't know why we're talking about teenagers so much, but it is an interesting subject that tends to come up a lot in conversations, and we're talking about mental health, and obviously you had your own experiences with it, but the family. I was just thinking, because a lot of families would have, before COVID, would have been very busy, and the teenagers and the younger kids, only had a few hours with their parents now and then. So I think that can be a huge plus that this has kind of opened up for people in the last few months. Yeah,
and very real conversations about what's happening in the world, the fear. I mean, even parents. I think one of the things that probably came up was that parents actually carry a lot of fears and worries and are trying to manage it all and don't have it all together.
Yeah.
And sometimes as a teenager, you don't pause long enough to realise that about your parents. You're so busy trying to identify with your peers.
Yeah.
So I think that possibly families had an opportunity to say, this is really uncertain. We don't know what's coming. We need to be careful here so you can protect your grandparents. And there was possibly more of a broader experience of conversing, which, I want to protect you as your parent more than anything else in the world. But in this case, I'm not quite sure. I'm trying to follow the guidelines of what's been told to me by the media.
Yeah.
Do you know?
Yeah, it was a real, I guess that's what you're kind of getting at there is parents sometimes, when parents are overwhelmed by what's going on in the world or what's happening in their lives, they can't really take the shield down, and let their kids see this stress. So it must have been quite stressful for parents too.
There's a balance in that. You can't follow. Well, it's nice if they know you still hold it together at some level, but you may have your moments.
Yeah, and then there's the gender thing as well, where you think like there's certain expectations that haven't really gone away to a certain extent, that the men are they're the stone of the family. They don't show any emotion. A lot of that's gone, but there's a lot of it still there, and I see it myself. I don't know. I just feel like maybe we've been talking about teenagers. Let's talk about men, and let's talk about Irish men. And how do you think Irish men have changed in the last 20 years as opposed to when you were growing up observing them? Just things that come to your mind.
I think that men have become far more involved in the family in a way that they may not have. An example that comes to mind very quickly, and my older brother won't be thrilled with me saying this, but I arrived at my parents' house with two small children and a buggy and in the boot, And my older brother nodded at me and said, "How are you?" And immediately went, took one of the children inside. But my younger brother, who's 12 years younger than me, he said, "I'll give you a hand with that." And he opened the boot and lifted out the buggy.
Okay.
But he just had an awareness even then.
Yeah.
And I notice him now as a parent, how involved he is with this child, how much he's... and I was lucky that my ex was actually interested and did get involved. But there was a sense of a need to be the provider that isn't quite so evident now. There's lots of families that are blended, first of all, so the whole role of men has changed. The role of men has changed, I found.
What's the term?
Blended, as in, so there's the mother and father separated, and there's another partner.
Blended, right, yeah.
You know, so the men in those cases have different relationships with the children that aren't theirs biologically, but they are living with. So that changes that. You know, that really brings in a whole new way of working and supporting their...
Do you think there's still, despite the positive aspects that you mentioned there, do you think there's still a sense within men that they find it difficult to understand themselves in their middle age to later ages? I find it, and it's just an observation that I when I see people, the fella at the bar, or the fella that looks a bit lost, the fella that's not being healthy to his body. Is there a little bit of something there's a sense of censorship, or there's a sense of withholding their emotions that's affecting them mentally and physically, that still exists today? I think it's still around. It hasn't gone away.
Yeah, and you know...
Now there's a huge amount of women issues too that I'd like to talk about as well, but I'm just saying from a male perspective.
From your male perspective as well, do you know, in my experience, and I do work with males, what I've discovered is something like what you're saying. What I've actually discovered with some males is not being sure what exactly it is that is being demanded of them, is being asked of them now.
Because it's kind of the two generations
are kind of meeting
a little bit. So there's probably hear their parents say, if you're a 50-year-old man, you might hear your father saying, "Go out and do a day's work," about this. You know. And then there's the modern generation who's saying something else. So it might be lost between the cracks, you know. Yeah,
and there is something about being able to be okay with having feelings and expressing feelings and finding a way to express feelings that is a healthy way to express feelings. Many people, men and women, find ways not to express. They become absolutely addicted to the gym. They go onto the internet. They could have, drugs, alcohol. We use whatever we can sometimes not to get in touch with ourselves, because we don't quite know what we've never really been trained in how to manage.
Would you separate the genders when you're talking about that kind of bad habits, for want of a better word, or would you think that there's specific issues with the male gender and the female gender, say, like, addiction issues, or do both genders have similar?
I think we have, human beings all have similar tendencies and traits, and we live out of an unconscious place and patterns we picked up as children. We're operating out of them far more than we know. But that said, there are certain things
to interrupt you, I think that's a big mistake we make, isn't it? That we separate our adult years with our childhood years. We're still the same person. So if we think, suddenly I'm 20 now, so I'm a different person, and if I feel sad, it's nothing to do with whatever happened to me as a child. It's continuous, isn't it?
It is.
And that's a pretty much factual thing.
Yeah, and oftentimes you'd have no idea that the reason you're reacting to this over here, which is kind of innocuous enough, is because actually something happened when you were 5, and your brain doesn't know that this is a different time and you're an adult now. So it goes into the same response because it thinks you're under pressure. Always you're trying to mind yourself. Survival mode is what you're trying to, get yourself to be okay and protected and safe. Your behaviours will always come to that, whatever you do. But if your behaviours are going back to a time when you were threatened, even if the threat was perceived and not real, that's not important in a moment when you're under threat. You go instantaneously into survival mechanism, which is operating from the limbic brain. It's the amygdala, which is like a warning. So what happens is your toaster has gone off and it sets off the smoke alarm. You think your house is on fire because you can't discern. It's just a warning. It's a smoke alarm. So your amygdala is like that. It's saying the house is on fire, the house is on fire, the house. And actually, you've just burnt a bit of toast. But we don't have that discernment. And that's because we had these patterns set up from when we were smaller. We've always had to survive. Human beings wouldn't have, Tigers would have eaten us if we didn't have this. But nowadays, we're still operating a lot of our lives from that place. And back to the teenager who's just trying to discern what's coming, what's my stress, I'm full of cortisol. If a teenager can learn, I just need to breathe through this, I'm going to be okay, in the same way as a 20-year-old male or female. Or you can say, when did I last feel like this? You might need to go and work it out with somebody to find out that actually was when I was 5 and my dad didn't come home one night, my mother was crying and I didn't know. Yeah. I was afraid for his safety or my safety. So there's an awful lot that we don't know, but my big strong feeling, and it has been all along, and especially since Dara died, was we have more power than we know, and we can always change something to make it feel a bit better. We can alter our behaviours, we can alter our mind, but we don't know that we have that power.
And when you say alter your mind or change your behaviours, are you referring to going back a bit? Or there's different ways of doing it?
There's loads of ways of doing it. So say, you can do cognitive behavioural techniques, which actually just get you to catch the behaviours, and this is my trigger and that's my belief, so how can I change it? Some people use NLP therapy, which is really about how am I thinking about this? Can I change that? And sometimes you need to go back and find the young boy or the young girl who's terrified and just put your arm around them and say, you know what? I'm an adult now and this is not the same. It feels the same, but it's not the same.
Well, that rings true to me. I mean, it feels very powerful to talk to yourself as a child. And I've had some experiences that where you're talking to the younger version of yourself, or the little boy, in my case, a little girl, whoever. And it feels real, because when you talk about it now, it feels like, that's just an imagination. But you're talking to a part of yourself that could, as you say, we carry around with us into our adult years, and by addressing. So I suppose if I was to send something out to the listeners, it'd be like, that it's never too late. You could be 77 years of age and you could be carrying something from being a young boy, and there's always time to go back there, and have a chat with yourself.
And sometimes writing can be helpful.
That I was actually thinking about this morning. Do you think, and I don't know, I've asked a few people this, I think, because I'm curious about it. Do you think that it's possible that, and I think it is possible, but maybe you can elaborate on whether it's common or not, that people can forget something dramatic that happened when they were a child that's hugely important and that's hugely influencing their adult life? Do you think it's possible to forget that and maybe through therapy or through whatever go back to it? Is it possible to forget? Can the brain... I know that it's happened before where people have had hugely dramatic things happen to them and they've forgotten that it's happened.
I think in my opinion, that would be that's a protective mechanism. If something is hugely traumatic,
you just go into your shell.
There's a way of protecting and shutting down that part of your brain so that you don't have to deal with it. And something like a trauma will often, so people sometimes suffer with post-traumatic stress, and there's very specific therapies can deal with that when a trauma comes back up out of seemingly nowhere. But it's actually something that does exist within the conscious realm somewhere. And in my understanding of consciousness and energy, because I do a lot of energy work as well, there's a part of us that can almost, as if a part of us leaves ourselves, splits away, because it's such a traumatic experience that it causes that split.
I've heard stories about that. It's not stories, it's real stories. Yeah. It does happen.
So it can be a difficult place to live from, though, because when you're living with that kind of split,
you could be frustrated and not know why.
Absolutely. Or you could be bordering with mental health serious issues, but actually it's all coming from this one spot and this one place or this one memory that has been parked or shelved. And again, it's back to that brain, just protection. It generally... Now, as I said, that's my opinion. I'm not speaking from a medical professional opinion, but I do feel there's really some resonance in that. Okay,
so Linda, it's been a great old chat, and I feel like I've gone through a few lies myself after that interview, and it's been really, really, really nice to chat to you. And I just wanted to, just for our listeners' sake, you provide therapy in various locations. Do you want to tell me where people would find you, or have you got a website? Or
Yes, I have. I work from Johnstown, where I live now, and I also work from a clinic in Clondalkin called Sacred Space. I see people one-on-one, and I also do groups, and sometimes I do speaking engagements. So I have a website, lindaallen.ie, and I also have a Facebook page at Linda